So we're going to take a look at the new president. Obviously, Vice President Andrew Johnson is going to turn president, we said, due to Lincoln's assassination, and only really a few hours after he dies. And he certainly doesn't have an easy task. Trying to keep the country together after such a tragedy? I mean, who would want to be president at that time? And then how would you proceed in moving the country forward? Now, he's got some things working against him. To make it even harder, he has no vice president. And even more than that, he was a Democrat, which means he's going to run into some problems with the radical Republicans who control Congress. Now, Johnson does not have as strong as leadership qualities as Lincoln, and if I were him, I would do exactly, or at least attempt to do exactly what Johnson does, and he tries to compromise. So he definitely runs into problems, but by the end of 1865, all of the former Confederate states, with the exception of Texas, had agreed to Lincoln's plan. Thus, Johnson is going to announce the restoration of the Union. So what kind of issues did Johnson run into with these radical Republicans? Well, first, the radical Republicans would not seat Southern representatives. It's because they were all Democrats, and some of them were even former Confederate leaders. So that's a heck no for the radicals there. But another reason is they most definitely did not want to lose Republican majority. So since the Confederate states had seceded, these radicals, these representatives said only Congress could readmit seceded states, and that they know, Congress, or these radicals know what's best for the South. Yeah, I don't think that's an attitude that is going to solve many problems, but that's the one they took. You see, the radicals in Congress had mixed motives. On one hand, radicals wanted to protect the rights of blacks. Remember the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery? But added to this, the South adopted these black codes, which they restricted blacks' civil rights and it kept them from voting. However, radicals, they wanted the votes from the 3.5 million freed men, ensuring that Republicans were going to be elected to office. So again, there's a little bit of mixed motives going on. Yeah, we want to protect the rights of freed men, but we also want to make sure we do what we can to have their vote. In June 1866, Congress proposes the 14th Amendment. This is something we looked at last time, which made former slaves, or again freed men, citizens. And this would give them protection, to allowed to have all the civil rights, and this includes the right to vote. That is a guarantee for them. Now, furthermore, though, it barred Confederate officers from holding office. So you can just guess how the southern states feel about this. Yep, they all reject it except for one, Tennessee. So Tennessee actually ratifies it, but all the other states, if you're going to try to bar these Confederates from holding office, yeah, they say heck to the no. So about a year later, on March 2nd, 1867, Congress passes the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Now, President Johnson vetoes this bill, which means he rejects it. But with our checks and balance system of government, Congress overrides it anyway, so this bill passes and becomes law. The bill divided the South into 5 military districts. And Tennessee's not included. Remember, they had ratified the 14th Amendment in the slide before. We said that. And it also, besides these 5 military districts, it appointed military officers with broad powers to govern each district. So they had a lot of power in these districts. And in addition to that, it dictated that any southern state that could be readmitted, they had to ratify the 13th and 14th Amendments. Remember, the ones that abolish slavery and guarantee civil rights to freed men and gave them the right to vote. Why would he veto this bill? Well, the reason Johnson vetoes it is because he believed that the military rule that was enforced in these districts was not solely for the purpose to maintain order or to prevent crime, but he says he sees it as a, forcing the people in coercion to force them to adopt principles that they're opposed to, and that they actually had the right to exercise their own judgment. And so he also thought that the appointed military officers, they're given basically the power like an absolute monarch. What they say goes. And he didn't agree with that either. Nonetheless, Johnson's decision to go against the radicals is going to have ramifications. So now with the radicals establishing this military rule in the South, they decided to punish Johnson for going against the Reconstruction plan. How dare you veto our bill? And President Johnson is going to be impeached, and he's the first president in American history to be impeached. He's not the only. Clinton was in the 90s, is impeached, and Trump just recently is the third. And in 1868, Johnson dismisses his Secretary of War, Edward Stanton. It was a member of his cabinet, obviously. And you're like, what for? Well, he's dismissed because he cooperated with the radicals and against Johnson's wishes. He didn't want him to, and he did it anyway. And so the House of Representatives, they're going to charge Johnson with what is, we see here, high crimes and misdemeanors. So again, we say that he is the first president to be impeached. And even though Johnson is impeached, you go, well, why isn't he removed from office? Well, the trial to remove from office is held by the Senate. So the Senate will have this trial to see if he's to be dismissed as president. And you'll learn this whole process next year during government. And so Johnson is not going to be removed, and neither was Clinton or Trump, because there's a 2/3 majority vote that has to be reached. And if it's not reached, then he will not be removed from office. So Johnson actually misses his 2/3 by only one vote. So he's actually closer than the other two. But he still stays in office, even though he's impeached. So moving on, troops stay in the South until 1877, and it creates much political and economic turmoil. The economic collapse in the South that we had talked about, it causes northern businessmen to move south, which is a smart move on their part. However, Northerners see this instability in the South as a way to turn a greedy profit in politics as well, and hence Northern politicians go south. Now they will be called carpetbaggers because they took all their belongings, kind of put it in a suitcase, and they took everything. But what they would do is they would try to manipulate local and state governments so that they could gain power. Again, this is another proof that mankind is inherently sinful. And this group, scallywags, that was the name given to any Southerners who cooperated with the carpetbaggers. Now here's what they simply tried to manipulate the freedmen. That's what they would do, using their vote to support the corrupt practices of dishonest men. Let me show you how bad it can get. These corrupt political practices, along with wasted tax money and loss of personal homes, kept the South economically depressed. And as a response, you can guess it, some Southern whites resorted to illegal methods by organizing secret societies to remove carpetbaggers, scalawags, and freedmen from political action. And one such society is the infamous Ku Klux Klan. And that's what they tried to do. They tried to remove these groups. And we know that they were both violent and racist. And even in a small sense, you still have Ku Klux Klan today. However, during the second term as president, this is Grant, when he is president, he issues the Amnesty Act of 1872. And this act restores political rights to most of those who cooperated with the Confederacy, which severely diminishes the political influence of carpetbaggers. Again, though, I will say that mankind is by nature a bunch of sinners. Because even though we've just seen all the stuff that is guaranteed, you have the 13th Amendment, abolish slavery, 14th Amendment guarantees blacks are citizens and all of these rights, and also the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, but they have all of these rights that are guaranteed by law now. You have by 1890 poll taxes and literacy tests in the South. They're put in place. And you would know why. A poll tax is where you would have to pay in order to vote. Now, my guess, not too many Americans would vote if they had to pay in order to do so today. So, there's literacy tests as well. They're implemented to prove that you can read to vote. Remember one of the things we said in the South, it was illegal to teach the slaves to read. So you know exactly what this is doing. So let's be honest, the reason why they put these in the South was to prevent as many as possible, or even to eliminate the black voting in the South altogether. And this actually would extend to poor, uneducated whites. Remember, the sandhillers or clay eaters, or these rednecks or crackers that we've talked about, they're going to suffer from this as well. And you know, many Americans over time will realize that both races will be treated unwisely during the Reconstruction of the South. And a good primary source on this is the autobiography of a former slave, and you've all heard the name Booker T. Washington. His autobiography is titled Up from Slavery, and it gives you kind of this perspective of what's going on in the Reconstruction in the South and how that affects basically all of these different groups. So it's a good resource. There are extremely hard times in the South. It obviously comes from the damages from the Civil War. However, Northerners, Southerners, freedmen, and former masters even began finding ways to restore harmony and cooperation. And you will have Northern businessmen go south to help rebuild farms and cities. I mean, honestly, the Confederate money was rendered completely worthless at this point, and no laborers were around to cultivate their farms. And actually, though, many of the freedmen now, they found themselves without homes and no way to make a living. So, Southerners, they had to sell their land or take out loans. But they also turned to something called sharecropping, in which a plantation owner divided his land into small plots, and then each is worked by a former slave and his family. And in this agreement, the landowner furnished the land and the tools, provided all the tools. Sometimes the local merchants would furnish the seeds and the supplies on credit. And so when you would finally have the harvest complete or completed, all three parties involved would share in the profits. So it was a way to work together in these various aspects. So on to the election of 1868. Well, it ended with the strongest Union Civil War general, unconditional surrender himself, Ulysses S. Grant, as president. That's how the election turns out. He's a Republican, and he's from the great state of Ohio, by the way. Now, because the Republicans were associated with these harsh years of Reconstruction, most Southerners actually, the voters in the South, become Democrats. However, Grant won on the strength of the new votes from Southern blacks. And during his first term, Congress passes the 15th Amendment, which this is the amendment that guarantees the right to vote for black Americans. But you can see it's based on color, race, slavery, nothing. They cannot be denied that at all. So his influence on passing this bill and getting it passed convinced the Southern blacks to re-elect him for another 4 years. So Grant will get a second term. President Grant was an upright and honest man. He really was, and he sympathized with the South. And he desired to reunite the country by healing these wounds that we've suffered from war. That said, Grant was a remarkable military general, but an unskilled politician. He lacks discernment and really puts too much trust in people who claim to be his friends. In case in point, a series of scandals involving dishonest government officials and businessmen as well, it hurts the reputation of Grant's administration. Again, like I said, mankind is by nature sinful. Because there's these many rings, is the word you see, or these groups of people that operate outside the law. You still have it today. And in these big cities who try to control governments. And in New York, William Marcy, or better known as Boss Tweed, he manages to steal $50 million from New York's city treasury. His famous Tweed ring specialized in bribing city officials. With all that said, there are major events that took place during Grant's presidency. A couple of them are the Chicago Fire in 1871, the invention of the telephone in 1876, and the phonograph in 1877, and Colorado becomes a state in 1876. So Reconstruction is coming to an end, and you're going to have the election of 1876, and it's a pretty tight race. The Republican is Rutherford B. Hayes. He's a Union general, and he runs on this plan to finally unite the North and the South. He's also from Ohio. But the Democrat is Samuel J. Tilden, who had gained a reputation for his honesty in busting and breaking up the Tweed ring. So Tilden actually in this election received 250 more popular votes. But there's a disagreement that arises over the electoral votes, because that's how you win an election in the United States. So an electoral commission gives the disputed electoral votes to Hayes under certain conditions, though, which became known as the Compromise of 1877, which officially ended Reconstruction in the South. So here is the Compromise of 1877. Well, Hayes becomes president, providing that, number one, all federal troops would be removed from the South. Get them out of there. Number two, Hayes would appoint at least one Southerner to his cabinet to work with him. And three, the federal government would give money to help the South for economic development moving forward. So we're going to end these notes with just looking at the Hayes presidency overall. He's actually only elected to one term. However, despite that, he did live up to the promise that he was going to bring the North and South together, and he did much to restore the country's morale. He did remove the martial law from the South as well, but he also reformed the civil service program. And what that is just people who work for government agencies. They work for the government. And so he reforms that, and he brings more honesty to the federal government. That's basically what we're saying. Hayes also believed that it was a responsibility of the first family to set an example for Americans, which is something that has continued on over the years. You see that with presidents and their families. In one such way that Hayes does it is that he bans alcohol at the White House. And his wife, later on, she became known as Lemonade Lucy for her time in the White House, where she would not serve the people who would come in there. She would not serve alcohol to them. Her nickname was Lemonade Lucy. But I will say she was greatly respected for her kindness and hospitality to everyone from Washington who would go to the White House. And this is not bad for an Ohio boy. Good old Hayes here. And I'll also say, how do you bring Reconstruction to the South? I always end by asking this question. How would you do it? Well, you elect 3 consecutive Ohioans to lead the way, because Grant is the first, Hayes is the second, and James Garfield, he'll be the third, though sadly he will be assassinated, only being in office for about 4 months. But that's later to be discussed. So, have a good one.